It's October, and if you've been following me, you know it's my favoriteest month of the year. So for this month, I want to cover cases that are a little different, a little strange and macabre, not your typical true crime stories. For this one, we're going to where else, Florida, where the discovery of a human hand led to one of the strangest cases the medical examiner had ever seen. So let's get into it. Hi, folks, and welcome back. Thank you so much for joining me. And if you're new here, my name is Delaney, and usually on this channel, I like to take deep dives into murder cases, and I tend to cuss a lot. But this month, I'm going to mix it up a little. No murders, but definitely some crimes involving dead bodies. I really want to call this series Cadaver Crimes, but that name was already taken by my queen, Caitlin Doty.
We're not worthy! We're not worthy! We're not worthy! We're not...
So I guess I'll just have to go with corpse crimes, which doesn't sound quite as good. Anyway, let's get into the extremely strange tale of Paula Albritton. Our tale begins in November of 1997 in Bradenton, Florida, a modest little city on the Gulf Coast sitting at the mouth of the Manatee River. One day, a city employee was working near the banks of the river when he spotted something odd floating in the water near the shoreline. So he went over to it to get a closer look. When he did, he saw that it was a human hand. Nearby, he saw two little clay pots and some decorative stones, so he called the police, who collected the evidence. They sent the hand, a left hand, to the Manatee County medical examiner, who determined it had likely belonged to a man. Also, it had been cut very cleanly and precisely, definitely not the result of decay or post-mortem animal activity, which was a real possibility since the Manatee River is home to both gators and sharks. But the hand was so waterlogged it couldn't be fingerprinted. So the ME had to use the glove technique. That's where you cut off the tips of the fingers and remove the skin, then put that fingertip skin onto your own gloved hand to take fingerprints. So the prints were entered into APHIS, and investigators resigned themselves to a long wait for a match, if any. But surprisingly, it only took a few minutes before the database returned a match. The hand belonged to Willie Suttle, a former garbage collector who had died behind bars in June of that year at the age of 70. His cause of death had been ruled as natural, and when his body had left the ME's office, he had both his hands. Meanwhile, divers were sent into the shark and alligator-rich waters of the Manatee River to try and find the rest of his remains. But after several days of searching with no luck, the search was finally called off. So investigators had to determine why Willie's hand, and only his hand, had shown up in the river 5 months after his death. They paid a visit to his grave at the New Memphis Cemetery, which is a potter's field for poor and indigent residents of the area. But Willie's grave didn't appear to have been disturbed or vandalized in any way. The only way to get to the truth would be to exhume his body. And that's when the red flags started showing up. First, his grave was kind of shallow, still within the legal limits, but definitely not the customary 6 feet. Also, he'd been buried in a flimsy wooden box, not a casket, which was nearly rotted away. Inside, his body was still in the same body bag it had originally been transported in after his death. When the ME opened the body bag, sure enough, Willie's left hand was missing, and his left wrist had been wrapped in a plastic bag and duct tape. Then the ME noted another strange detail. There was a red biohazard bag containing Willie's organs at his feet. Now, putting the deceased organs into a biohazard bag is pretty common after an autopsy. But normally, the bag would have been placed back inside the body. The ME couldn't understand why it had been removed. So now, with all these strange inconsistencies, the ME decided to examine the remains more closely. He had Willie's remains x-rayed, and what he saw there was even stranger. Buried deep inside Willie's arms, legs, and torso were several pins. These were clearly not the kind of medical pins used to stabilize bones. They looked more like sewing needles, and they weren't in bones at all. So the ME reopened the original autopsy incisions to find out what these pins were about. What he found inside Willie Suttle's body was nothing like anything he had ever seen before. Stuffed inside the man's stomach and chest were no less than a dozen small, hand-sewn cloth dolls. It was apparent to the ME that Willie's autopsy incision had been carefully reopened to remove his organs and place the dolls inside, then re-sewn shut. So the dolls were removed and examined as evidence. Each one had a handwritten note pinned to it. Most of the ink on the notes had washed or faded away, but a few of them were still legible. One, which was addressed to someone named Richard Woody, read, "Be gone and may you rot in your grave." The note went on to invoke Damballa and said, "Curse him as I curse him, spoil him as I spoil him by the fire at night." Now, it's important to note that Damballa is the most important loa, or god, in the pantheon of Voodoo and other African diaspora religions. He is believed to be the sky father and creator of all things. Similar elaborate curses were written on the other notes, each one aimed at a different person. It didn't take a whole lot of digging to figure out who Richard Woody and the other people named in the curses were. They were all local funeral directors. So now, seeing as how this was clearly not the work of grave robbers, investigators needed to determine where Willie Suttle's remains had been between the time they left the ME's office and the time they had been buried. Records show that Willie had been released to the Green Funeral Home for embalming and burial. Green Funeral Home was a small business that had been in the Green family for generations. Now it was run by Paula Green Alberton. So in June 1998, she was brought in for questioning. At first, she claimed to have no knowledge of what had been done to Willie's body. But after more questioning, she finally admitted to the officers that she had placed the dolls and notes inside his body as a, quote, religious voodoo ritual called the Helping Hand to protect her business.
I am a voodooist, and I've survived because I know how to survive, and that's a part of my religion.
The people she had cursed were competing funeral home directors and her ex-husband, just for good measure. Later, she said she had taken his hand to a bridge where she recited some incantations, placed it in a bag with 2 clay pots and some stones, and dropped it into the water. She claimed this ritual was meant to bring Willie's spirit peace since it had nowhere to go. So Paula, along with her son, Jimmy Clark, was arrested and charged with ritual abuse of a corpse, a second-degree felony. Jimmy pled no contest and was sentenced to a year in prison. Paula pled not guilty, but was convicted by a jury in 1999 and sentenced to less than a year of prison. The case was so strange, it was featured on the HBO series Autopsy, hosted by forensic pathologist Dr. Michael Bodden. However, in 2000, she appealed that decision. She claimed that her confession had been given under false pretenses because the officer who questioned her told her she wouldn't be prosecuted if what she did was part of a religious ritual. Paula claimed she lied to protect her son, who was mentally ill and hearing voices. Jimmy agreed, stating he had cut off Willie's hand and put the dolls inside the body because the voices told him to. He swore his mother had nothing to do with it. Of course, that doesn't explain why the voices told him to curse his mother's competitors, but okay. The Second District Court of Appeals agreed, ruling that her taped confession could not be admitted into evidence. Without the confession, the prosecutors felt they didn't have enough evidence to recharge her. So her original conviction ended up being overturned. Probably thanks to all the negative press attention, Paula Alberton sold her family funeral home and moved away from Bradenton. I haven't been able to find out anything else about her, or even if she's still alive. As for Willie Suttle, 3 weeks after he was exhumed, he was laid to rest in that same plot, this time with a small Christian service attended by his family. So that's it for another terrible story. If you liked it, go ahead and click that like button, subscribe, and consider joining my membership. You'll get early access to videos and bonus content. Till next time.